In the part 4 section, we are going to talk about the system calls. Okay. What is system calls? System calls is actually something which act as an interface between the software applications and kernel. Between the software applications and between kernel, the interface acting here is considered to be the system call. So this is an interface which is between these applications and the kernel. So system call, basically what it does is that they are providing services of the OS to the process view API. Now how does it provide services of the OS to the process? There are different processes. So how does it provide services of OS to the process through API? Now what do we mean by API? API is application process interface. Through this API, the system calls will provide services of the OS to the processes which is happening here. Now let us understand what is actually the system call is. So when a process is being executed and it requires any resources, the process will create a system call, that is interrupt, and send it to the kernel. So whenever there is a process came, let's say P1, the P1 is currently executing, but suddenly the P1 requires some resources, some data to further processing of this information. So in that case, when the P1 requires more data, what happens is that when it requires any resources, this process would then create system calls, right? This process would then create system calls, which is otherwise known as the interrupt, and send this system calls to the kernel. So to enter the kernel, we require system calls. So you can say that the entry point to the kernel would be only through the system calls. So how does it work? So let's understand the working of the system call. So whenever a process is executing in the user spaces are happening here, what happened here is that it requires some resources. If it requires some resources, it will do system call. Through the system call, it can enter into the kernel space. Through system call, it enter to the kernel space and it will execute the system call. Execute the system call and it will return to the user with the resources, right, by executing this system call. You have to understand that in the kernel space, you are creating actually a table of system calls in the kernel space. This kernel space contains a table of system calls, and on the basis of priority, each of the system calls will be executed. Based on the priority, only the system calls will be executed, and one by one, each of the system call will be executed and will be returned to the user. So this is the overall working of the system call. So first of all, when the process is getting executed and suddenly it requires resources, then it calls the system calls. Then it enter into the kernel space, and the kernel space contains a system call table, and based on priority, each of the system calls are being executed, and then it's returned to the user. So this is the overall working of the system call. This point we have already said, that the system calls are the only entry point to the kernel space. Yes, so the system calls, through only the system calls you can basically enter to the kernel space. So the entry point of kernel space is basically the system call. So this is all about the system call in the operating system.